There we go. Welcome to the final seminar of the Spring 2020 Biology, Ecology, and Evolution Seminar Series, also known as BEES. The seminar series is organized by graduate students in the Applied Ecology and Biology departments here at NC State, and we continue to be grateful for the support of both the departments and the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences for their support of this series. Today, we are very honored to virtually host Dr. Nalini Nadkarni. Dr. Nadkarni is a professor of biology at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and her research focuses on the community ecology of temperate and tropical rainforest canopy plants, as well as the effects of fragmentation and climate change on these ecosystems. Dr. Nadkarni is also an advocate for science communication that engages sectors of the population that do not access or might not have access to science education, such as incarcerated individuals. Her science communication emphasizes incorporating art, the humanities, and spirituality to tap into the connection between humans and nature. If you have any questions during the course of this seminar, please feel free to type them in the chat for us to get to at the end. And with that, I will let Dr. Nadkarni take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks to all of you for being here and your departments for sponsoring this. I do wish I could be in North Carolina right now and see your beautiful spring coming up in North Carolina. But for now, what I'll do is share my screen and start my talk about Tapestry Thinking. So what I'd like to talk about is creating a trajectory of research and broader impacts in ecology. I think this is really appropriate to think about because Earth Day actually is tomorrow. And I remember Earth Day back in 1970 when I was still in high school and just being so excited about thinking about the ecology of the planet and how we high school students could help with ecology and cleaning up, trails and so forth. And of course, the meaning of Earth Day, the meaning of protecting our planet and nature and humans on it, of course, has become more and more of a priority as time has gone by. And from my own observations about working with both ecological research and also thinking about protection of the trees for me, which are, just incredibly important on our planet, but also other objects of nature. What I have found over the years is that I often find myself kind of walking on this knife edge, this ridge between despair and hope. Because when you think about environmental challenges like climate change and invasive species and deforestation, if you fall too much on the side of despair, I think it makes people feel kind of immobilized, like I can't do anything about it. But if you sort of fall on the side of hope too much, then people say, oh, well, it's all being taken care of by technology or by other people or by conservationists, so I don't have to worry about it. So one of the things I'd like to think about or have you guys think about as I talk through this, and maybe we can discuss this in the question and answer time at the end, is how do we individually and collectively go about walking this knife edge between despair and hope as we contemplate and work on implementation of solutions to these environmental challenges. And I'd like to use as kind of a theme throughout is this little tiny poem by an Indian poet named Rabindranath Tagore. And he wrote, "The tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever joining and breaking." And I think that really means that when we want to create a tapestry of humans and nature, we have to think about the many threads, the diverse threads of expertise, of experiences, of cultures, of understanding that can come together to help build that tapestry of nature and humans. And so I'd like today in my talk to sort of split this up in three ways. First, to tell you a little bit about some of the research that my students and my colleagues and I have done to understand the tapestry, the interweaving of species and interactions that occur in the forest canopy. And secondly, I'd like to talk about how we might weave the threads of science in with other societal sectors like the incarcerated or artists or religious groups. So that's a real weaving of science and society. And finally, I'd like to think about and sort of pose the question of, who the heck is at the loom? Who's actually doing the weaving of these threads into this tapestry of nature and humans? So let's start with this, and I'd like to sort of address this question specifically, which is we recognize that access to science and nature has many benefits, physical benefits, societal benefits, emotional benefits, psychological benefits, but many people lack access to both science and nature. And so I'd like to pose to you as emerging scientists, how can scientists engage with other sectors in society? And secondly, what are the challenges and benefits of doing that? And my guess is, having had a little conversation with Laura and some of the others, I think that these questions are very much on the minds of people, not just peer ecologists, but also people who are doing applied ecology, people who are working in the realm of conservation and resource management. So I think these are pretty relevant questions for a wide spectrum of people who are concerned with understanding nature. Before I kind of get going on the research and the public engagement, I just want to, since I'm not there here, or I'm not there in North Carolina, I'd like to just introduce you to my family as a way of getting to know me. These are my parents. My dad was from India. He died about 15 years ago. He came to graduate school in the United States in the 1940s for his PhD in pharmacology. So he was a straight scientist. He worked for the National Institutes of Health for his career. He was raised as a Hindu, and we were raised with a lot of Indian culture and traditions. And my mother on the right is from Brooklyn, New York. She's of Russian parentage. She was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and she studied languages. She was very interested in communication. And so I think you can see from this that I came together, you know, I'm one of 5 siblings, and I really came from this family of mixed culture, of mixed language, of mixed food, of mixed beliefs, and mixed approaches to understanding the world, science and communication. And as a little kid, being the middle of 5 kids in this sort of chaotic household, I found refuge in climbing the trees that were in my parents' front yard. There were these 8 maple trees. I got to know them all very well. And they were kind of where I went for myself. I was the only one in my family who climbed trees. I got a sense of peace and refuge and safety in those trees. And I remember as a little, I don't know, 8 or 9-year-old kid, sort of taking a very solemn oath and saying, when I'm a grown-up, I'm going to help protect trees. And I didn't know how I would do it. I thought, well, I'll be a forest ranger, or I'll be a park ranger. But I didn't really discover the field of ecology until I went to college. And I learned about ecology, and I learned how people study trees. They can actually make a living by understanding and communicating about trees. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do with my life. And of course, as a graduate school student, everybody has to make a choice about what they study specifically. And I decided to look at the forest canopy and try to understand the interactions of forest canopy dwelling organisms with the whole environment, the whole forest ecosystem. So I studied ecosystem ecology, and I got very interested in the forest canopy. My graduate committee was not all that excited about my choosing the canopy, because at that time, the canopy was called the last biotic frontier. It was like virtually unknown. It was like this unknown territory. And of course, as a graduate student, you're supposed to pursue unknown questions, right? So I said, well, nobody knows anything about the forest canopy. So I went about learning mountain climbing techniques. And since then, canopy researchers have developed a wide array of tools to get up into the canopy safely and non-destructively. For instance, we use hot air balloons. We use canopy walkways. We've installed construction cranes in the middle of primary forests around the world. And so getting into the forest canopy has really become sort of a given. We now know how to get up into the canopy, and we can now focus on the interesting and fascinating, and I think very important scientific questions that occur up there. And I think if I brought all of you into the canopy, I mean, I'm sure Michelle already knows this because she's explored the forest canopy, is that the forest canopy, the upper canopy, has a very different microenvironment and architecture than what you find on the forest floor. So there's a lot more sunlight. There are greater extremes of relative humidity and temperature that you can record in the upper canopy. The architecture of the forest canopy is like the series of cylindrical tubes of branches on which these canopy dwelling plants get safe spots and are able to live and evolve up high above the forest floor. There are many animals that live for all of their life cycles or part of their life cycles up in the forest canopy, including vertebrates like mammals, birds, snakes, and many, many invertebrates as well. But you know, although the animals are pretty interesting, I found myself getting much more interested in the canopy dwelling plants, or the so-called epiphytes. Epi meaning upon, phyte meaning plant. So any plant that gets its support, but not nutrients from its host trees. So these plants do not put any roots into the vascular system of host trees, but instead get their nutrients and water from atmospheric sources. Another part of the canopy kind of scene that I was really interested in are the canopy soils. These are true soils, they're histosols or highly organic soils that occur underneath the mat of living epiphytes up there. So they're really decomposed and comprised of the dead and decomposing and decomposed elements of the living plant community up there. And they comprise a real soil that is highly organic, that fosters a rich variety and diversity of invertebrates that live in that canopy soil. And many of the plants, especially the vascular plants, put their roots into this nutritious soil and gain their nutrients from that as sort of a recycling. Well, as someone who was trained in ecosystem ecology, I was really interested, not really so much in the composition of the plants that live up there or their structure or even their physiology, but what are they doing in the ecosystem? What are their ecological roles or functions in the forest as a whole? And I have done most of my work in the cloud forests of Costa Rica in a place called Monteverde. And some of my work has been done also in the temperate rainforests of Washington State, where you get similar accumulations of living epiphytes and this canopy soil. So as I mentioned, these canopy dwelling plants don't have a structural connection to the roots or to the branches that support them, but rather every single raindrop, every single droplet of mist contains a small amount of very dilute nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, all the macronutrients that plants and animals need contained within raindrops and mist droplets. And epiphytes have, over the time of their evolution of living in the forest canopy, this sort of soup kitchen in terms of nutrients and water, have evolved ways that they can intercept and retain these atmospheric nutrients. Non-vascular plants like the mosses and lichens and liverworts are really good at absorbing those nutrients actually through their foliar surfaces. Bromeliads, which have this tank form, are really good at holding on to nutrients within the tank or the rosette that they have. And this dead organic matter is really efficient because of the negatively charged surfaces on their carboxyl and hydroxyl surfaces are really good at holding on, especially to the cations that flow through the canopy in the form of rain and through fall. So some of the work that we've done has really been trying to understand the quantity of nutrients that epiphytes are able to intercept and retain within the system. And one of my graduate students named Ken Clark learned that about 60% of the nitrogen in the form of nitrate and ammonium that comes in from atmospheric sources are actually intercepted and retained by canopy elements. And those canopy elements hold on to those nutrients within the canopy in the form of those epiphytic and soil mats, but eventually they will fall down to the forest floor, either by just being sloughed off due to their own weight, which we call epislides, or that they'll actually ride down on broken branches and tree falls. And so those elements, those nutrients that have been captured from outside sources actually end up as part of the internal cycling of the forest as a whole. And so now what we have come to understand then is that these epiphytes, although small in biomass relative to the forest as a whole, have a disproportionately important role in terms of this interception and retention of atmospheric nutrients that come from outside the ecosystem and remain inside for internal circulation. Some of my students and I have also done some studies about the ecological value of these epiphytic resources for the bird community. And we spent hours and hours one summer sitting up on little hanging cots in our field site in Costa Rica, keeping track of the bird visits that came to the epiphytes, that is to the nectar in flowers, the mosses that they might collect for nesting material, versus the host tree resources, the flowers and fruits of the host tree. And then we found that overall, 1/3 of all of the foraging visits were to canopy plants, not to the host trees. So again, they're forming kind of what we now call a keystone element in terms of providing resources for the animals that actually use these plants for foraging. Well, as the field of canopy studies has developed, this sort of recording and documenting the natural history, and the basic ecology of these canopy dwelling plants has really increased. So you can see that starting in the early 1990s, there's been this sharp, almost exponential increase in the number of studies that have been published about canopy dwelling plants and animals. So on the y-axis, you see the number of citations. On the x-axis, you see the year of publication of canopy related articles. And so there's been an enormous escalation in the amount of information that we have about epiphytes in primary forest ecosystems. Well, having learned from my early studies that these epiphytes are really important ecologically, I've been wondering about, so what happens when we disturb them? What happens when there are physical disturbance of these epiphytes? And we did a number of studies where we looked at the effects of disturbance on epiphytic communities. We did one early study where we actually cleared branches of all of the epiphytes and the canopy soils. I had expected them to come back very quickly because they're so darn lush. They just cover every single square centimeter of branch surface area and trunk surface area. But what I found was that the response was actually very slow. I actually found also, I had also predicted that these epiphytes would sort of encroach from the side, like grass, on a sidewalk. Well, I was wrong on both counts, actually, as many scientists are, that in fact, they didn't encroach from the side. They came from the bottom up. They actually first colonized on the bottom of the branch, where the substrate remains moister for a longer period of time. And gradually they would then grow up and around the branch to coalesce on the top where more epiphytes came in. The other surprising result is that it took a heck of a long time for these things to grow back. So we cleared the plants in 1 year where I marked removal, and it wasn't until 13 years later that we saw any kind of recolonization at all. And that came on the bottom. And then it took another 10 years really for these epiphytes to start growing back up and around until they finally coalesced. But even after 22 years, only 40% of the cover has come back. So this taught me then that although these plants look really lush and productive and vibrant, they're actually quite vulnerable to physical disturbance. And that is something that I really had to keep in mind as I thought about the long-term sustainability of these plants.
Do you know why it took so long for them to start regrowing?
That is a really wonderful question. And I guess we could talk about that. I think one of the pieces, in terms of answering that question is about the substrate itself. That is, when you strip away all those epiphytes, you end up with a branch that is effectively very dry, especially on the top, because the sunlight, that heavy duty sunlight that I talked about when I was talking about the microenvironment of the canopy, is beating down on the tops of those branches. So it makes a very, very dry sort of habitat. And I think the second thing is lack of texture. That is, many of these tropical trees have very thin bark without furrows. And so I think it just takes a long time for those, especially those non-vascular plants that start out the colonization and primary succession, when they can start growing around there, they actually hold on to moisture, they hold on to nutrients, and they provide this texture then that seeds like an orchid seed or bromeliad seed can sort of get buried and stuck in. And then we start seeing this sort of vibrant recolonization after there's some texture, moisture, and nutrients that are available to those recolonizing epiphytes. That's one hypothesis, but we can talk about others too.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks for asking those questions. So disturbance is really a big deal right now in tropical cloud forests. They're one of the most vulnerable ecosystems on our planet. And one of the reasons why is because of rising land and sea surface temperatures are happening, which then push up these layers of cloud and mist that are such an important piece of the climatic regime of these cloud forest ecosystems. And Eli Helmer and her colleagues published a paper recently predicting that over 75% of the existing land cover that is now in tropical cloud forest is going to disappear or shrink enormously in just 25 more years. And so that's a grave concern to people who are studying and who are living in cloud forest ecosystems, is this idea that the nourishing mist and fog that is so characteristic of these ecosystems is really in effect disappearing. That's not the only disturbance that's going on in tropical cloud forests. One of them relates to deforestation and forest fragmentation, whereby the creation of pastures and other agricultural uses of land are actually isolating small patches of trees that were formerly in primary forest, but are now isolated in an ocean of pasture. And what we don't know yet is whether or not the pollinating birds, the pollinating insects are able to cross this ocean of pasture and actually make it to these relic trees, and will then sustain biodiversity and ecosystem function that we have noted happens in these primary forest trees. So this is, I think, a very rich area of research, both theoretical in terms of looking at the effects of isolation and sort of islandization of trees, but also in terms of practical aspects, such as if you can save 3 trees in a pasture, do you clump them? Do you spread them out so that birds might leapfrog across? And these are the questions that my colleagues and I are now addressing. We have a grant proposal into the National Science Foundation to try to understand the physiology and ecology of these relic trees in terms of maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem function. Well, you know, at the same time that I've started to look at relic trees as objects of my research interests, these trees that are isolated from their former neighbors, I've also been thinking a lot about the isolation of human beings from nature. And this growing sense of isolation, this sense of distance from humans and nature, I think is something of great concern to every scientist and really everybody. You know, 3 years ago, over half the population of the world was documented as living in urban environments rather than rural or suburban environments. So we're dealing with really a population that is now dominated by people who do not have daily interactions or have the awareness of the extreme critical nature of that tight relationship between humans and nature. And so I guess about 15 years ago, as I was, you know, sitting up in my canopy perches and in the reserve that was nicely protected by the Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve, I remember hearing a chainsaw, like just outside the borders of this park, this reserve where I'd been working for the last 25 years. And I thought, oh my God, a chainsaw, like right outside where I'm working. And I realized that I needed to think about what I was going to do about that. And I felt that as a scientist and as a person, I needed to do something in addition to publishing my little papers, you know, for other scientists to read about the importance of epiphytes in tropical cloud forest ecosystems. And so I began thinking about ways that I could participate, that I could walk that knife edge, that knife ridge between despair and hope, and hopefully put more hope into that formula than just despair. And I began thinking about connections I might be able to make that would allow me to participate in raising the awareness of the importance of trees and forests to all kinds of people, not just scientists. And I remembered back to when I was a little kid, you know, when I was climbing trees, that is where I forged this really intimate connection with trees, this really strong connection with trees, and this strong passion to protect them. But then I thought about, well, some little girl that's grown up in Tokyo or New York City, like she does not have the capacity or the opportunity to forge that kind of relationship because there just aren't the trees around and the culture to support it. So my students and I began thinking of ways that we might attract young girls to sort of the canopy or being a canopy scientist. And we thought, oh, well, Barbie, every little girl, including my own daughter, I have to say, when she was 6 years old, just loves Barbie. So we thought, well, why don't we make Treetop Barbie? And we can dress her up in, you know, like field clothes and give her a crossbow, which is the way we get the lineup first. And we made a little booklet which describes canopy plants and animals. And I called Mattel and checked in with them and said, wouldn't you like this idea to have like a whole new audience of little girls who want to have adventurous careers? And for some reason, they were not interested in that. They said, no, thank you. We design our own Barbies. Thank you very much. So we decided just to go ahead and do it anyway. So now we buy Barbies from, you know, consignment stores, Goodwill stores, Deseret Industry stores, and then we dress her in these clothes that are made by volunteer seamstresses. We buy the little helmets on eBay, and we send her out with, you know, with this little booklet. What was really amazing, and that was back in 2004. And then in 2020, just last year, I got a call from National Geographic, and they had partnered with Mattel to create a set of dolls called Explorer Barbies, basically taking this idea of, you know, a professional scientist, but giving her the accessories and so forth that would allow her to have a life of an explorer. And so I was asked to be an advisor on this, which I did with great joy, of course. And a thank you, they actually made a Nalini, one-of-a-kind Nalini look-alike treetop Barbie, which I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of to have. And I think what's so cool about this is it's not about my idea to make a treetop Barbie, and it isn't even about Mattel or National Geographic. I think the meaning of this is that society has shifted. So now there are lots and lots of little girls who say, Mom, I want you to buy me an Explorer Barbie instead of a prom Barbie who's going to catch Ken as a boyfriend. And I think that's really a statement about the progression that society has made in terms of more young girls aspiring to either understand biology or to have a career themselves, or to be a mom that nurtures girls who want to explore our natural world. And so I think it's a very positive thing that has happened. So another thing that I learned from that experience with making this Barbie is that I think it might be possible to interweave the threads, the strands of ecological values with other societal sectors. So for example, using Barbie as an example, we were able to weave together the recreational value that little girls have for Barbie with the ecological values of aren't trees and understanding trees really important. And so what I'd like to do now is to tell you a little bit about some of the connections, some of the interweavings that my students and I have made with other societal sectors, not just Barbie, but we'll talk about some spiritual values that we've been able to weave into ecological values, and some of the social justice values that we've been able to also sort of create this tapestry of nature and humans. So let's start with spiritual values. This idea of saying, well, there are a lot of people who are religious. In fact, 80% of humans on Earth self-identify as being religious or believing in God. And that is a much higher percentage than those who self-identify as environmentalists or ecologists. And so I thought, well, if I could link together the ecological values of trees with spiritual values, maybe I'd have something here and I might be able to communicate with a vast number of people about the values of trees. And although I was raised as a Hindu Jew, you know, I feel like I am aware of the fact that when you look at the Old Testament, you know, there are two very important trees on the very first page of the Old Testament, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so what I did was I decided that what I would like to do is to use as my authorities, not the scientific authorities of climate change and deforestation, but rather use the authorities that religious people use, which are their holy scriptures. So I downloaded the world's religions, the holy scriptures of the world religions, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Talmud, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, and so forth, and pulled together all of the verses that relate or have the word tree or forest in them. And so, for example, with the Old Testament, I found that there were 328 references to the words tree or forest, and I categorized them into these different categories of symbolic and aesthetic use, analogy to God and life, practical use, location descriptors, tree loss is bad, and so forth. And I was able also to go to the different traditions of religions. For example, the Jews have this fantastic holiday called Tu B'Shavat, where they celebrate the new year of the trees. And they have this special Seder, this special dinner, where they eat fruits and nuts and other gifts, so to speak, of trees to people. Many of the Native American traditions create wooden masks that depict the creatures that live in woodlands. Buddha, for example, was, he found enlightenment underneath the bo tree. And people who follow the religion of the Quran, the Muslims, often look at tree forms for looking at the form of the word Allah in Arabic. And so they when you go to the web and you look up Islam and trees, you find all these pictures of trees that have the image of Allah written out, I mean, of course, by accident, that sort of demonstrates to them the fact that there is God and the presence of Allah in nature objects. I visited a number of churches for about 2 or 3 months. I would just pick a church, find out when their services were, and go there and sit in the back pew and just observe, kind of immerse myself in the church environment so that I could do a better job of understanding what goes on in a church. What are the sacred objects? How do people behave? I found that there was a lot of emotion in the sermons that were delivered. Very often members of the congregation would respond. I found that the people at coffee hour after the service were really friendly to me, even though I wasn't a part of the church. And so that allowed me then to start knocking on church doors and offering myself as a scientist, but as someone who was very interested in religion, to give a sermon about trees and spirituality. And I've done this in about 40 different places of worship of all denominations: Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Buddhist. And I've really never had any confrontations about like creationism versus evolution, because I was using their holy scriptures as my basis. And I really didn't push any science. But if there were people afterwards, after the sermon, who were interested in finding out more about climate change or deforestation, I was more than happy to provide handouts and information about that. But I think it was a very non-confrontive way of working with a community or a set of communities that might not automatically think about trees and science as an important part of their set of beliefs and values. Since then, we've done more than just giving sermons. We've actually mapped the trees that grow in churchyards, which we consider sacred ground. So if the ground is sacred, I guess, the soils are sacred, and I would imagine the trees that grow in the soil of churchyards are also sacred. So we made these little booklets that have information about the trees in each of the courtyards of these churches. And we have biological information about the different species, as well as scriptures that refer to that particular species. So we provide these to the congregants so that they get a better sense of the fact that they are protecting the trees in their churchyards. But also we hope that they will think about the fact that, maybe there's a tree just outside their churchyard that is also kind of sacred, or the trees in the mountains above the city trees are entities that are valuable as well. I've also given talks at seminaries where clergy get their training so that they might bring these messages to their own congregants when they set up their churches. And we've also participated in church tree planting activities. Many churches are becoming more and more aware of what they call creation care, of taking care of the things, the organisms, the species, the entities that God created. And so that's really kind of the same thing. It's common ground with people who believe in science. Maybe evolution was the vector rather than God's creating it, but we all have the common ground of wanting to protect these entities that are important to us, whether they're created by God or whether they evolved over evolutionary time. We're concerned about them. So in that way, we've been able to, again, weave some of the spiritual values going to the venues of where religious people gather in order to provide these messages and this kind of engagement that allows for exchange and the finding of common ground. So now I'd like to go to the third set of values, which is social justice values. And I'd like to talk about some of the work that we've done with incarcerated men and women and youth. There are over 2.3 million men and women, adults, who are incarcerated in our country. They have very, very little access to education, almost no access to science education, and almost no access to nature. And it seemed to me that this was a population that perhaps could use or could take advantage of or be interested in what I had to say and show and demonstrate about the importance of nature to them. So in 2004, when I was still a faculty member at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, I started a little lecture series at one prison. It was a state prison about 30 minutes from my college. I knocked on the door of the superintendent and I said, would it be possible to start a science lecture series for the inmates in your prison? He was a very forward-thinking superintendent. He said, well, it can't hurt, maybe it'll keep them busy. Maybe they'll be interested in it. Sure, we know that education helps reduce recidivism. So, bring on the scientists. So we started this little lecture series. It was we first just started giving lectures in the chapel. We actually had the inmates and the officers sitting in the same room listening, which was kind of unusual. And that led to a great deal of interest. The men and the women were very engaged. They were asked great questions. We did some pre and post lecture evaluations. We provided 10 pages of readings for the inmates on the topic of each of these lectures. And we found really just a fantastic amount of interest. And we were also able to demonstrate some really cool things about the impacts of these science lectures given by scientists to the inmates who are in the Draper State Prison, the Salt Lake County Jail, and in our 4 juvenile detention centers. So this is from a paper that we recently published in the journal Science Communication. What we found that in terms of looking at the pre versus post, the pre-lecture survey results showed us that there was and the post-lecture survey results showed us that there was a significant increase in the science knowledge content after each of these lectures. But we also found that there was a shift in what we call the science identity of these inmates. That is, how do I see myself as a science learner? Well, many of these inmates have had really terrible educational backgrounds because of broken families, or just their backgrounds have not given them the opportunity to get a really great education. And so they tend to think of themselves as being stupid in science or not liking science. But what we found was that when we asked questions about their STEM or science identity, was that there was an increase in that after our lectures. There was also an increase in how they rated the value of science, and also an increase in their desire to seek out more information about science, either from the prison library or from future lecturers, or to share what they had learned with their families and their cellmates. So our kind of conclusions about this activity was that even with as few as one single lecture, we were seeing significant changes, positive changes in science knowledge content, STEM identity, knowledge of the value of science, and people trying to look for more science information. Well, that lecture series led to our finding or creating conservation projects. We started connecting with conservation groups, like for example, our first project was with the Washington State Fish and Wildlife Department. They had an ongoing program to rear or captive rear the state sensitive species of the Oregon spotted frog. And so they already had the protocols from raising these frogs from egg to tadpole to adult frog. So they taught the men how to do this. The men were very successful at rearing these little frogs. They augmented the ecological restoration project that was already ongoing. And that led then to other collaborations. For example, we started collaborating with the Nature Conservancy. And right now, the men at Stafford Creek Correctional Center are raising 300,000 plugs of rare and endangered species for some prairie restoration projects. Well, in 2011, I came to University of Utah to join the faculty here, started similar prison programs here in Utah. And for instance, the men at the Salt Lake County Jail have been building kestrel nesting boxes to improve the habitat for the American kestrel, which is declining all the way across North America. So these folks have really been sort of practicing citizen scientists in a really wonderful way. We've also engaged the women at one of the women's facilities to raise the federally listed tailored checker spot butterfly, again, from egg to larvae to adult butterfly, who are then released to these protected prairie areas where they live and breed. In 2017, we were able to extend what we do with the adult inmates to youth in custody. And we got a contract from the Utah State Board of Education to provide science lectures, career lectures, teacher training programs, art science workshops, and actually hands-on conservation projects such as growing milkweed plants for monarch butterfly populations in Utah. So we've been able to spread this to the youth who are really so needful of this, I don't know, inspiration, connection with people outside facilities, to provide them with some hope and prospects for how they might contribute to the scientific enterprise as they move through their lives. We've been also collaborating with some government agencies like NASA. We've been working with them to provide NASA scientists access to incarcerated populations across the country, in Ohio, in Utah, in Florida, in Washington, and Utah, to provide lectures about astrobiology and expose these inmates to like some of the really super basic questions, which is like, what's the origin of life in the universe? What was the origin of life on Earth? And these are big questions that that it's not just scientists who think about these things, it's really everybody who wonders and thinks about these things. And so we've been trying to provide them with the scientist perspective while still respecting other perspectives, like a religious perspective, in these discussions. Well, I guess, for the last, the first, 8-10 years of this work, we were really happy with what we were doing with the inmates that we had ready access to. But I also learned pretty early on that there's a whole level of incarceration that we were not able to penetrate with our lectures or our conservation projects. And of course, that's the population of men and women who are in what's called secured housing or solitary confinement. These men and women are incarcerated in very tiny cells the size of a parking place. They're concrete blocks. They remain in this cell block or this cell for 23 hours a day. They get 1 hour a day in their exercise room, which is just slightly larger than this cell, and they're allowed to walk around or do pull-ups or push-ups. And that's what they get to do. But they really have, just unbelievably no interaction with nature at all. And so it seemed like maybe this was a place to draw a thread, a strand from another sector, which is the medical sector, and that is to draw upon the work that's been done in behavioral psychology, which has documented the fact that when patients are in a hospital, another very nature-deprived habitat, I might add, if patients look out at a concrete wall versus at a tree, if they look out at a tree or some facsimile of nature, what researchers have documented is that they recover faster, they use fewer narcotic drugs, there are fewer complications, fewer nurse complaints, and they feel less stress, less anxiety, less aggression. So that seemed like the perfect treatment or intervention in a place like a solitary confinement cell block. So we got permission from the administrators at the Snake River Correctional Institution in Eastern Oregon, which is a supermax prison, to give us access to a cell block that is split into 2 parts with the same officers, the same control room, the same risk factors for the inmates. And in one exercise room, we put in a projector and the inmates were allowed to choose one of 38 nature videos that we provided. And in the other side of the cell block, we didn't show them videos at all. And what we found was that after a year, we came back and we gave surveys to the inmates as well as to the officers. And we found that the inmates self-reported that they felt calmer. They could bring a sense of calm back to their cells for some length of time. They felt that the guards were more open to their well-being. But most significantly, we found that there were 20 of the men who watched the nature videos on their side of the cell block committed 26% fewer violent infractions than those men on the same cell block that did not see the nature videos. So this turned out to be something of value, not only to us in terms of providing nature to people who needed it, not only to the inmates who were calmed and felt better and more connected to nature and to other people through watching these videos, but also to the superintendent and the administrators at the prison, that they could bring their violent infractions down, which is a value that they have within their world of corrections. The scientists who connected with these inmates in terms of the lectures and the conservation projects have reported that there are benefits for them. It's not just for the inmates, but the scientists who made that intimate connection with these inmates, most of whom, almost all of whom had never set foot in a prison before, found that in fact, they found better communication skills. They were better able to communicate with learners of diverse backgrounds. They got a sense of meaning of their own research, their own work, and a sense of contribution, a sense of participation in social justice issues. For example, some of the scientists said that they joined Black Lives Matter or wrote letters to their congressmen about more educational funding for the incarcerated. So to me, this has been, when I think about what is the meaning of this, I feel that it's a really important meaning in that if we can offer scientists the opportunity to engage with an seemingly unengaged group, we can do what we do, which is convey our research, convey our science to other people, but that it will have perhaps some social justice benefit as well on the part of the scientist, not just on the part of the incarcerated. Now we know, and I just want to say this like with the loudest voice that I can, we know that these little projects, these little programs, these little lectures do not do what we need to have done to fix our present system of a broken system of mass incarceration. That being able to give a lecture or a few lectures or get a few people lined up with conservation projects is not going to fix the underlying really regressive and difficult system that our society has produced in terms of incarcerating its citizens. But it is something that scientists can do to improve the lot, at least in a short-term way, of the inmates with whom they encounter. So in terms of connections then, what I'm really interested in sort of showing you is that it's very possible, it's kind of not a big deal to interweave these ideas of science with ecological values. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is who is at the loom, who's actually weaving this tapestry of nature and humans. And I think what I've tried to show you is that, you know, there's some very unlikely groups or entities that might participate in forging this and creating this tapestry. It might be Barbie, it might be one of the inmates, it might be somebody who's involved with churches or some youth in custody. All of those people have contributed to this tapestry of humans and nature. And I think that scientists should be part of the cadre of weavers at this loom. And so what I'd like to talk about just a little bit, let me just check in with Laura about my time.
You're totally fine. Yeah, you got some time.
Okay, great. So one of the things that I've created is a program called the STEM Ambassador Program. And I use the analogy of ambassadors, just like the State Department does. When we think about, you know, people in the US, they want to find out about what's going on in India for political purposes, cultural purposes, and people from India then can communicate with the ambassador to relate information back to the United States. Well, that's the same thing we're trying to do with the STEM Ambassador Program, that there are representative scientists from science, but that they serve as ambassadors to other societal groups that can then provide information about their group back to the scientist. So the training program that we have evolved, that's been funded by the National Science Foundation in 2016 until 2022, is basically, it's built on relationship building. It's synergistic between the scientists and the audiences. And the main idea is to find trust and common ground for engagement. And you can take a look at our website and our social media. I'll just describe the program a little bit because I think it's relevant for emerging scientists. We try to identify connections with a particular group based on the research topic of the scientist or the disciplinary scope of the scientist, or also, and this is, I think, what makes it unusual, the persona of the scientist, the hobbies or the ethnicity or the familial status of the scientist. So for example, we had a wildlife biologist talk to a group of hunters in a hunter education class about the importance of monitoring wildlife movements with remote sensing. We had a neuroscientist talk about aging at the brain at at a number of senior citizen centers, and of course, the people who are living in residential senior citizen centers are very interested in aging in the brain, and so Chinu was able to provide some science behind this. We also had a scientist, a microbiologist, who's interested in fermentation cooking herself, serving as assistant chef. In a fermentation cooking class at a local grocery store. So she was able to share her knowledge of the microbiota that are responsible for fermentation. And finally, we had a pigeon geneticist whose mom was actually a stay-at-home mom, give a talk to a mom's meetup group about pigeons and her work with genetics. And one thing that I wonder about in terms of those who are at the loom is wondering about those, you guys at North Carolina State University, and how your work might fit into this weaving together of your knowledge of nature and of science with other societal sectors. So maybe that's something that we can talk about in the discussion as well. So in terms of, you know, discussion about this knife edge of despair and hope. And when I think back to little Nalini when she was a 9-year-old girl, you know, I wonder, like, what do I tell her? What would I tell her if I could reacquaint myself with her and her dream of protecting trees and forests in her career? And I would say, for one thing, that I have found that academia has been a really wonderful loom for me to carry out both my research, as well as my public engagement work. I mean, I think working at an R1 institution can sometimes be kind of separate and stultifying in that, you know, it's very siloed, that there's biology in the biology department and art in the art department. But I have found that if you take the initiative, academia can be a really fantastic place to carry out both research and public engagement. In terms of lessons learned, I would say that engagement can take a long time. You know, I started out in 2014 with my little silly, you know, treetop Barbies, but then 15 years later, it turned into this big scale thing. So I just had to be sort of patient and wait for that bigger reality to happen in terms of, you know, what was going on with public engagement using this particular approach. I want to emphasize also that small scale engagement can be really effective. You know, I talked about my big prison project and all these churches I go to, and I'm sure many people think like, oh my God, how does she ever have time to do that? I have to get my dissertation done. I don't have time to start a prison program, but you can do it small scale. Like one thing I did that was really great was I had like an hour to kill in a city. And I noticed these two young women who were looking at each other's fingernails. And I myself don't care for nail painting myself, but many, many people do. And so I thought, well, I've got an hour. So I went into a manicurist and I asked her to paint trees on my fingernails with bright green paint or fingernail polish. And so for 2 or 3 weeks, you know, until it all chipped off, I was able to start conversations with lots of people because they noticed my fingernails and they went like, what's going on with your fingernails? And then I could talk to them about their fingernails. And then I got to talk about trees because I was so excited about them noticing the trees on my fingernails. So that's just a really small thing that you can do that's very direct person to person. Another thing you can do back when we get on, you know, whenever we get to fly in airplanes again, one thing I do is I just put up a PowerPoint with like some tropical slides. Then I shift my computer slightly to the right. And before I know it, I'm in this conversation with my seatmate, you know, talking about trees or his trip to Costa Rica or why rainforests are important. So you can have a really good long conversation with somebody about what they think about trees and forests and share what you know about trees and forests in this very simple way. And you may say, well, that's just like you're talking to one person. What good is that? So I did the math. It turns out there are 325 million people in the US. There are 6.2 million scientists. So if each scientist talks to just 52 people a year, that's only one person a week outside of science. We will have spoken to every single person in the United States. So you can imagine a conversation with the barista, you know, when you buy a latte, talk about shade-grown coffee. When you get a ride with an Uber guy, you know, talk about climate change and the use of gasoline and electric cars and so forth. So engagement becomes sort of an attitude. It becomes a way of being. It's not something that becomes separate in your life. It's what you do all the time. And I hope that doesn't sound crazy to you, but it's really been wonderful for me to do that. And I think all of us can do that and we'd have a really big collective effect. A third principle that I would tell the little Nalini is to have humility for others' perspectives. And this connects with like a precept that is in philosophy about intellectual humility. And I think it's very difficult for scientists to have intellectual humility because we think we're right. You know, we think we have the best way of knowing. And the way I can sort of analogize this is like, I really don't care about sports. I really do not care who wins the World Series or the NCAA. I just don't care. It's not interesting. But you know what I found out is that in baseball, the National League and the American League, the bats are all made of wood, either ash or maple. Now that's a connection to me because I care about trees. So now I would go to a baseball game just to figure out like, is that bat made of ash or maple? So there's a connection for me based on my love of trees, not my love of sports. And so I think we have to think about humility in that way, that not everybody is going to be enthusiastic about science or nature. So we have to find ways for them to connect, just the way I connect with baseball now because of those baseball bats. And I think another sort of thing that I've been thinking a lot about has been about what I call the broader impact trajectory. That is, what are the things, the interventions that could be done that would help you graduate students, if you stay in academia, or even if you don't stay in academia, to get experience, to be comfortable with, to be able to do effective public engagement. And I think we haven't really set this up in academia. We talk about our research trajectories and what we need to do to put forward our research, but we don't think that much consciously about the kinds of things we might do to improve our broader impacts trajectory. So that could be another item that we can talk about. So when I worked with trees, or when I worked with churches, part of that idea of intellectual humility had to do with my putting aside my beliefs about religion in order to connect with and find common ground with people who are religious. The final thing I'd like to end with, and especially because of thinking about you guys as having a lot of decisions that you're going to make about your future career, is that pathways may not always be pathways. So we often think about, well, what's your pathway? How are you going to go from A to B, from a graduate student to an academic? Like my brother, and this works. This is a model that works for some people, like my brother. He always wanted to be a doctor. He majored in biology, then he went to med school, then he got a fellowship and a residency, and now he's a really great doctor. So A to B worked just fine with him. But I think many people, especially creative people, it's not a model of A to B in a straight line, or even in a sort of, like boingy line. I think it's actually more like a big pot of spaghetti sauce in which there are meatballs that are moving around. And you guys are starting out at meatball A, and then you might have, like, after you graduate, you say, oh, here's an internship or a postdoc that's coming. Should I take that postdoc or should I not? I don't know. So you might say, well, I'm going to jump on that postdoc, meatball B, and you ride that one around for a while. And then maybe an academic position comes up and you say, no, I don't want to live in Nebraska. I'm going to stay on meatball B. So you go through your career basically making decisions based not only on your choice, but also chance, which meatball has come around for you to jump on or not. And I think there are a couple of lessons to be learned from this if you follow the meatball model, which I certainly did in my career, which is, number one, if you're following the meatball model, you have to pay attention to the matrix. You have to be aware of when these meatballs are going to show up and you're going to make that choice to jump on them or not. Secondly, if you're going to think about using models of people. Like if you look at my life and you say, wow, she's got a pretty cool life. She's got this full professorship and she gets to do all this cool outreach work and everything. And you ask me, Nalini, how do I get to you at Meatball Z? I'm going to have to tell you, I can't give you advice, because when you think about it, in the time that it took me to get from my meatball A to Z, all the other meatballs have moved around. Like, for example, the field of Canopy Studies has changed completely. When I started out, nobody was doing canopy research, and everything I discovered was like, publish that paper. But now there are hundreds of canopy researchers, and the field of canopy research has really changed. And so I think what I need to tell people when they say, how do I become like you, is that, well, you can't, because it's all moved around. You can do something different, and you really need to think about what meatballs you're going to choose for your career, and those will be just fine. So with that, I look forward to answering questions, to discussing any of the things that I brought up, and to finding out more about what meatballs you might be thinking about in terms of connecting and finding ground with this wonderful, beautiful, useful, complex, connected tapestry of nature and humans. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nadkarni, for that amazing and wonderful presentation. It was definitely great hearing how your passions for trees and nature have led you to do all of these incredible things that are really inspiring. I guess we could take questions now. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand in the chat and we can call on you. Whatever.
Oops. Am I not hearing anybody, or it suddenly went?
Grace, I think Grace has a question.
Okay, great. Grace, where are you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really fascinating. I was particularly interested in your prison collaboration project, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you sought out partnerships for those projects, since you work with such a diverse group of both prisons and science organizations.
Yeah. Part of it had to do with being an experienced scientist when I started out. that prison project. Because number one, I had the credibility as a scientist, as a professor, to sort of knock on the door and talk to a superintendent and say, I think this could be really valuable to your inmates. I think it could be valuable for academia, and I think it could actually benefit what your mission is. Because you always want to present a proposition like, can I bring some, some scientists into your facility? You want to make sure that it fulfills their values. So for a superintendent of a prison, what is he or she concerned with? Well, you look at their website, it says, we maintain public safety. There's no wording in there about education. There's no word in there about training people to raise frogs. It's about public safety, which is what's involved with that is reducing recidivism and increasing the probability of post-release employment. So what I had to do was to show somehow, or convince him somehow, that what I was proposing to do, to come and bring lectures and conservation projects, would actually fulfill his goal, his mission, not mine. It would be like if a prison superintendent came to my biology class or ecology class and said, hey, I want to give a lecture about corrections or about, administration of a prison. I go like, what the hell are you here for? That doesn't help my ecology class. So I always had to sort of couch this in terms of, what are the values that you are following and how does this activity connect with that? The same thing happened with conservation groups. What they were really interested in was getting more organisms in the ground. I mean, they needed more frogs, they needed more butterflies, they needed more rare plants for their prairie. And we said, we can do this. We can do this. These guys are really good at it. In fact, the first year that the guys started raising the captive frogs, they got the best captive rearing award in Washington state because they did such a good job of watching the frogs, of feeding them, of taking care of them and so forth. And once we had that going, we could then go to another conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy and say, hey, these guys did a fantastic job with the frogs. Don't you think you might be able to connect with them in order to grow these prairie plants that you're interested in? And so it was really kind of a set of personal, professional connections that I had to start out with. But then as we got more media coverage, after they got written up in the Seattle Times and magazines and so forth, other conservation groups began coming to us and saying, do you think they could handle raising the Taylor checker spot butterfly or the Western pond turtle? Or, so we began getting gigs from these different conservation groups based on the reputation that we were able to build at the very beginning, slowly, carefully, so that we could ensure that this was actually a really good investment for the conservation groups to accomplish what they were after. So I think a lesson, again, another lesson is make sure that you pay attention to the values of the sector, the societal sector that you want to work with. For example, when I started the nature imagery program where we brought nature, videos to the inmates, I started out going to the superintendents of these prisons saying, hey, I think I can bring down violence and I can bring down stress and anxiety and by just showing these nature videos. And so the superintendent said, hey, yeah, that looks great. Yeah, that sounds great. Go ahead. But the officer said, why should we do this? These guys are animals. They're being punished. We shouldn't make them feel better. And so I kind of had to put that idea aside for 2 years, but I gave a TED talk about it. And as it turned out, I got a call from an officer at Snake River Correctional Institution where I found that Supermax prison. He said, Dr. Nadkarni, I saw your TED talk. Do you think that would really work? And I said, well, I don't know. I haven't been able to try it out. It's just a concept right now. He said, well, what if I started a forward thinking committee and we got guys together and the superintendent, and would you come and help us set this up? So I said, yeah, of course. So in 2014, we got access to that prison. But what he said was, well, you're talking about making the men feel better, but won't this make our work safer? Because there'll be fewer violent infractions, fewer times where we have to go in and subdue these guys. Wouldn't that be a benefit? And I suddenly thought, oh my God, of course. This is why I didn't get into those earlier prisons, because I was only thinking of my values instead of their values of making a safer workplace for the officers. So I said, yeah, this is going to make it a safer place for the officers. And so again, it was thinking about what are the values for the particular people in that particular sector that I can shift what we're doing and our values to conform to what they want. And I don't think it's dishonest. I don't think it's mendacious. I think it's about understanding the need for people to do things that meet their own values. And that's true of all of us. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really insightful.
I think Elsa also has a question.
Thanks. Yes, I did. Loved your talk, of course.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. My question actually goes back to an earlier part of the talk when you showed how it took so long for epiphytes to recolonize after you removed them. And I was just curious about the backstory of that project. Like, did that removal happen like when you were a grad student needing results in a couple of years? Did you know it was going to be super long term when you started? Like, how did that all come together?
I wasn't a grad student. I was a young assistant professor grappling for tenure, at UC Santa Barbara, where I started out with my first academic appointment. And it was just one of a number of experiments and studies that I did, knowing, well, I had assumed I would find out the next year that it had all grown back. So I was convinced when I started it out that, oh, I'll get a paper out of this, after 1 or 2 years. And then when it didn't happen, it actually became more and more exciting. It was like, oh my gosh, there's nothing on these branches for 5 years, for 6 years, for 7 years, for 8 years, for 13 years. And now it's coming on the bottom of the branch. So it turned out to be just one of the things that I was asking the trees essentially and the epiphytes that didn't have a payoff for, pretty much 25 years. And so it's probably a poor choice for a dissertation topic, but it would turn out to be a really good choice for someone, who was already well along in terms of starting her research program. But I didn't see that coming. But that's the beauty, that's why we're scientists, right? It's because if we knew the answers, then it's not worth asking the question. It's all about discovering, these new things that you're concerned about in the systems that you choose to study.
Cool, thanks. I'm glad you're able to keep checking on them every year for that.
Yeah, me too.
I also have a question. For the ambassador program, do we need to submit any paperwork, or are there any projects or any initiatives that the program is targeted towards, or is it just us reaching out and talking to you guys and kind of talking to you about our ideas on any topics?
So the the STEM ambassador program is now kind of a formal training focused on scientists to try to teach them how, or guide them to provide public engagement work in the venues of community groups. And so what we've developed with our NSF funding is a semester-long training program. The cohort is a cohort-based training program. Cohorts are like 15 to 20 people per cohort. We have a set of 5 workshops that start with what we call the connect exercise, where we brainstorm ideas for which public group are you going to be interested in connecting to based on your research and your persona. The second workshop involves what we call immersion visits, where we have the ambassadors actually spend time in the venue and with the groups of people that they want to engage with, like my going to the churches and just sitting there and observing. That would be an immersion event. The third one is a design workshop where you actually create and design the actual engagement event that you want to do. It might be like giving a sermon at a church, or doing a tree planting with a church, or making a booklet, or writing a blog, or making a podcast, whatever seems to be most appropriate for that particular focal group. And then we have another workshop that's called an engage workshop, where we give you techniques to just improve your communication skills. And these techniques are based on science of learning research about how people actually learn. And then the fifth and last component of that is a workshop on reflection and evaluation. How did I do? What responses did I get? How could I have done a better job? What did I learn about this? And so we see this as kind of a circle that might lead you to do another engagement event based on what you learned from your first engagement event and so forth. Right now, we've been giving nearly all of our cohort-based trainings here at the University of Utah, but our second grant from the National Science Foundation is to learn how we should scale up and sustain this program within the university. So now we're sort of experimenting with what we call a site facilitator model, where there might be a faculty member like Elsa might say, oh, I'd like to give this program here at North Carolina State University. So we give her some of our training materials, but we at the STEM Ambassador Program actually carry out the trainings remotely by Zoom calls. And then you guys at NC State would carry out your engagement events locally, in your communities. So right now we're kind of at this experimental stage of trying to understand how can we scale this program so that we can train people at other institutions as well. But if any of you is interested in this, why don't you just send me an email and I will send that to Caitlin Weber, who's our program manager, and maybe we could get some kind of a training gig going at North Carolina State if there's enough interest in that. It's definitely movable, and COVID has actually helped us move more quickly than we had anticipated towards a remote and virtual training modality, because we've had to do that, obviously.
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand.
Did you come up with the meatball analogy, or is that someone else's?
Well, what was funny is this is a really interesting thing that happened. I was at the Evergreen State College and there was this women's brown bag lunch. And the president of the university, Jane Jervis, a woman, came in and talked to us, and she decided just to talk about her career. And so she related her career as starting out as being the wife of a pre-med student. And she was taking care of him and earning the money for the family. And then she got an editor job and she was sort of cleaning up people's messes, as she said, editing, and she was cleaning up the family's messes. And then she sort of moved into a house mother job at a college campus. And she did a really good job with that. So she became a dean. And then she became the president of the Evergreen State College. And she said, my husband is really different from me. He just had this straight line, he just went from pre-med to med school, and he's this fabulous doctor now. Whereas I, the woman, jumped around from place to place, and she was like putting herself down for the way that she went about creating her career. And I thought, this sounds wrong. There's nothing wrong with not going in a straight line, I don't think. And so that's when I began thinking about, what is the analogy for someone who is on in a place and with constraints, but still has this opportunity to make choices about, does she take on this job or that job? Does she stay with her kids? Does she become an editor? And so after thinking about it for weeks, I sort of came up with this idea of, we don't have to put ourselves down for not following a straight line. We should be proud of the fact that we take opportunities and we make choices. And so I met with her afterwards and I said, Jane, I think you've got the model wrong. And I told her this idea of the meatball story, and she thought it was great. And then I've kind of thought about that a lot and used it a lot, especially as when I work with my graduate students who are all kind of concerned with like, oh no, I don't know what to do. I mean, if this internship goes by me and I don't take it, I'll never have another opportunity again. And I said, yeah, you will. There'll be another meatball that comes along. And actually, it's not just about your jobs. It's also about people. Like, there's some guy you date. Is he the guy you really want to stay with or not? Wait for another meatball. That's just all you have to do, to wait until the right one comes along. So this idea of choice and chance, this idea of paying attention to the matrix, this idea of not going to somebody senior to you to get advice about how to get where they are, that really evolved from this one conversation that I had with Jane Jervis about her feeling bad about the way that she had gone about her career in contrast to that straight line of her husband. And I think what I learned also, as I've talked about this with other people, is that women tend to be have that more of a meatball kind of approach to life, because very often they choose to stay home with their kids, or they maybe don't have as many opportunities as some of their male counterparts. So I think it's something for women to pay attention to very much. And most importantly, to not put themselves down for not following that straight line. And when you read about women in science and minorities in science, very often you hear about the leaky pipeline. And that nothing makes me more angry than that, which is, it's as if there's a failure on the part of a woman or a minority to not make it, so to speak, to being a full professor, or not going through that pipeline as quickly as possible. I mean, there might be reasons why people choose not to stay in the pipeline that are very good reasons, and they might have alternatives that turn out to be just fantastic, really productive, really useful, really wonderful. And it's their choice. And so I really tend to stay away from, you know, these stories of, I think they're stories of women who have fallen out of the pipeline, because I don't think that's necessarily the wrong thing or a bad thing. I think we need to determine how we best contribute to this world. And if it's a straight line, well, that's great. And if it's not a straight line, that's fine too. So there. To all the doctors of the world. And I'm not putting down doctors or people who go through straight lines. I think that's great. But I just keep thinking about how poor Jane felt so bad about herself because she was comparing herself to a straight line. And we don't have to do that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Nadkarni.
Sure.
If anybody doesn't have any questions, I think we are safe to say that we can bring this to a close. Thank you so much again. It was such a wonderful opportunity to hear you speak, and it was definitely so inspirational. So yeah, you brought this seminar series to a wonderful close.
Great.
So we're all very happy about that. And thank you everybody for joining us. We had 40 people today, so it was incredible to see. So yeah, thank you so much. Hope you guys have a wonderful evening.
Enjoy your meatballs, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
We will.
Okay,
Thank you.
take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.